Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Joe Shields. I'm the Interim Dean for the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon. And this presentation is brought to you in conjunction with the Wealth and Poverty theme in the College of Arts and Sciences, led by Dr. Young Kim, seated right here. The Wealth and Poverty theme provides opportunities for our students and faculty to engage with some of the big questions around inequality in the world, its origins, its consequences, and how we can and should respond to its challenges. The Wealth and Poverty theme brings together faculty and students across a range of disciplines and explores topics ranging from the global context to issues that deeply affect our local region. Our focus today is on our local region, with sponsorship reflecting that interdisciplinary nature of this topic. Our sponsors for today's event include the Appalachian Rural Health Institute, the departments of Geography, Political Science, Social and Public Health, and Sociology and Anthropology, in addition to the College of Arts and Sciences. And I'd like to thank each of those units for their support. Thank you. We're honored today to have with us journalist and author Brian Alexander. Mr. Alexander is a native of Southeast Ohio, born and raised in Lancaster. He is a prolific writer whose works speak to a broad range of topics in American culture, with articles published in venues that include the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Science, Outside, and the Atlantic, among others. He is the recipient and nominee for multiple prestigious awards, including being selected twice as a finalist for the National Magazine Award and the John Bartlow Martin Award from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, recognizing public interest journalism. Mr. Alexander is also the author of multiple books on culture, science, and public policy. His talk today is based on his most recent book, published in 2017, entitled Glass House. In fact, here's his copy right here. I'll hold up. You see it up there. The 1% Economy and the Shattering of the All-American Town, which describes the relationship between the Anchor Hocking Company and the town of Lancaster. And through that story, provides insights into how contemporary business practices can impact the social fabric of our communities. I should tell you that copies of this book are available for purchase at the entrance to this room back here. Nick from Little Professor will be very happy to sell you a copy, and I want to thank him for helping us out today. The story we'll hear about today is particularly compelling and poignant since it takes place in our own backyard. We're delighted to have Brian Alexander here with us today to share perspectives on Glass House, Anchor Hocking, and Lancaster, Ohio. Please join me in welcoming Brian Alexander.
Thanks very much, Dean Shields, Dr. Kim, for having me down here. What a great host. All the other departments who've got me here today, it's really my honor to be here today. I think that this is a very important topic, obviously, and I think it may be the topic of our times. So I appreciate your attendance on a kind of a rainy, cloudy, crummy day, so thanks for coming inside. It's also especially nice to be here in Bobcat country, because as the dean mentioned, I grew up just up the road, up 33, and a lot of my friends came here to OU to go to school. And I still hear stories. Of course, a lot of those stories involve taverns. But I'm given to understand that you don't drink at OU anymore, so things are different now. America's been dealing with the subject of wealth and poverty since before the founding of the country. It's one of the reasons the country was founded, to try to create a somewhat more egalitarian place. In the late 20th and early 21st century, as I mentioned, it has become the topic of the day. Turn on CNN or any other TV news outlet, read any newspaper, and you're going to hear something about the 99% and the 1%. Presidential candidacies are now based on this. There's a good reason for this. We have an enormous wealth and opportunity gap in this country. And it's my belief that therefore we also have an enormous social and cultural gap in this country. Some of these slides will probably be familiar to those of you who study demography and sociology especially, and rural health for that matter. I believe that a lot of what we are seeing today came about as the result of what I call the advent of vulture capitalism. We live in a time of severe social and cultural alienation. We are socially sick. Sometimes we are literally sick. This is a slide of the wages that we have in this country. No, it's not. This is a slide of population and median wages. Look what happened starting in the 1970s. Interestingly enough, when I say that we're literally sick, I mean it. This is a graph of white people in the United States. The one over there is white people with no high school. Look at other industrialized nations. Not everything is dependent upon one force when we're talking about a community. Multiple forces act on our communities. So it's important to keep in mind as I speak today that I'm going to be speaking about one particular force, but I don't mean to imply that that's the only thing at work in our communities. Overall, however, I think there is one sort of grand unified theory, and I believe that is the erosion of the social contract. There used to be an implicit deal in this country. If you obeyed certain rules, you took certain steps, good things would happen for you and your families. You'd be able to buy a house. You'd be able to send your kids to college if that was the plan that they had in mind. You would have a decent older age, a decent retirement. That was sort of the deal of our democratic capitalist system. I believe that there's been a tremendous erosion in the social contract, and there's a lot of sort of evil that comes from that erosion. This was a slide I got from an acquaintance of mine named Shannon Manat. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Shannon's work. She's now at Syracuse. She's a demographer. What you see here is not just about mortality rates by drug abuse or family dissolution by drug abuse. There's something else happening. I've been saying for a long time now that the issue in Southeast Ohio, now frankly in Northwest Ohio also, Indiana, really all across the country, it's not about heroin. There's no one particular drug. Anybody in this region, if you talk to any public health official in this region, throughout Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, they'll start to tell you now about a giant resurgence in methamphetamine. And in fact, emergency room doctors are now seeing injectable methamphetamine. It just so happened that while the social contract was being eroded, we also had the advent of pill mills, followed by heroin. If any of you have read Sam Quinones's really terrific book called Dreamland, part of which takes place in Portsmouth, Ohio, you know about this dynamic. So I don't have to spend a lot of time talking about that. But don't focus on the individual drug. And frankly, I'm a little concerned that, for example, the state of Ohio is very opiate focused right now, that's not a bad thing necessarily. But there are things at the root of that, so that it's not only about the particular drug in itself. So I grew up in Lancaster, as I said. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about it. This is the cover of Forbes magazine from 1947. It's the 30th anniversary of Forbes. So Forbes it was after the war, and being very smart, Forbes decided that a new economic order was being created out of the ashes of World War II, and he was very much of an anti-FDR New Dealer. He thought New Dealism was socialism. And so he wanted to find a town that epitomized the glories of capitalism. The town he picked was Lancaster, Ohio. Do we have anybody from Lancaster here? Okay. Do we know each other? That's Main Street, the corner of Main and Broad. In the right-hand corner up there, that building became the headquarters of the Anchor Hocking Glass Company. It's a pretty busy, thriving, vibrant place. And in fact, it was that. I grew up there, and I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember Leave It to Beaver, it was really very much that town. I don't mean to imply that it was a utopia. It was certainly not a utopia. If you were a liberal Democrat, it was not a utopia. If you were gay, nobody knew you were gay. There were about 10 black people in town, and they were not all that welcome. There actually was a very long history of racism in Lancaster, Ohio. Very acceptable racism in Lancaster, Ohio. At one point in the 1920s, when the Ku Klux Klan was newly emergent in the upper Midwest, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, the mayor and the sheriff were both out and open KKK members. They would actually pressure people to not serve Catholics. And I tell the story in the book about a town dentist named Dr. Iman who had Catholic patients. And they came to him and said, "Stop seeing Catholic patients or you're going to go on our blacklist." And he said, "Well, to hell with you. I'm going to see Catholic patients anyway." As a result, every Catholic in town went to Dr. Iman, and he became a very successful dentist. So it was not paradise. I don't mean to imply that. But I do mean to try to communicate that this was considered to be a very sort of orderly, prosperous, cohesive community. Now, why was it that way? Well, it had businesses. We live in a capitalist system, and you need businesses who employ people, who pay taxes, who have places to go. And among the reasons you need businesses is because you need an upper middle class and upper class of educated people. After World War II especially, Lancaster, Ohio had that. One of the reasons they had it was because of the Anchor Hocking Glass Corporation. It was founded in 1905. So it made it through the Great Depression rather successfully. In fact, it sort of cushioned Lancaster against the Great Depression. By the 1960s, it's the world's largest maker of glass tableware and the second largest maker of glass containers. Beer bottles, mayonnaise jars, peanut butter jars. It made a fortune on making baby food jars. It was not the only glass company in town. My father worked for Lancaster Glass, which formerly was known as Lancaster Lens. Lancaster Lens, at the time, made the lens that went in the Statue of Liberty's torch. It made most of the black and white TV picture tubes used in this country. It made taillight and headlight covers for automobiles. So it was also another thriving glass company. And historically speaking, the reason that glass really got going in Lancaster, because almost by an accident, Lancaster discovered that it sat basically right on top of a lake of natural gas. And so heat and labor are really the big expenses in glass making. So the glass industry migrated somewhat to Lancaster. Now, after World War II, what happens? Guys come back from the war, they walk right back into that plant. That is plant one. Same site that was there in 1905, different plant because it actually burned down in the 1920s and they rebuilt it there. So they've been making glass on that land for about 114 years. They came out of Italy, they came out of France and Germany, the Pacific, and they went back to work in the furnaces of Anchor Hocking after having seen a lot of the world. Why would they do that? Because they made a good living at Anchor Hocking. Then they loved their town. And after World War II, as the company expanded, new executives came into town. And what's more, and very important, their wives came into town. In those days, it was wives, because a lot of those women didn't work outside of the home. But boy, did they work in the town. They had the time to do sidewalk levy drives, school board drives, bond issue drives, work at the election polls. I got the polio vaccine because they had a vaccine drive. So there was this great mass of civic involvement. If you drive through Lancaster today, you'll see these beautiful antebellum homes in Lancaster. The reason they're there is because these women got together and formed the Fairfield County Heritage Association and said, we need to do something to restore all these great homes. So you created a web of a society. And the foundation of that were the companies that were located in Lancaster. It wasn't really strictly a company town. That's been something of a misunderstanding of the book. Anchor Hocking was the dominant country by far, but Diamond Power, which made industrial sip blowers, was there. Ralston Purina moved into town. I don't know if they still make bugles and whistles, but when I was a kid, it's these snacks called bugles and whistles. They were made in Lancaster. So there were other employers in town. But as I say, it was really Anchor that was the mainstay. So what happens? How did things begin to erode? Well, partly it was politics and government policy, and partly it was a shift from making things to extracting things. In this part of Ohio, you know a lot about extractive industries, coal mining, for example. This is an article from the New York Times in the 1980s during the Reagan era that is sort of documenting this change in business philosophy. It was a change in the culture of business. It became somewhat less about making the product or providing the service, and somewhat more about how you engineer money out of a company. As a result, there was a change in the view of what business and capitalism was supposed to do. A very famous economist named Milton Friedman came up with this idea of shareholder value. He stated very baldly, the only social responsibility of business is to maximize shareholder value. That was never really the way it was with Anchor Hocking or the other companies in Lancaster. When the town needed a new addition to the hospital, doctors and local leaders would go to Anchor Hocking or they would go to Lancaster Glass. Why? Because the executives all lived there. Their families all lived there. They were as invested in the town as everybody else was. Their kids went to school with the factory worker kids. I.J. Collins, if you're familiar with Lancaster, there's the Hotel Lancaster, and then there's Mulberry Hill, for example. I.J. Collins lived right there. 3 blocks away from him, factory workers are living there. There's no gated community. Nobody ever heard of a gated community. So they were part of the fabric of the town. So here comes Milton Friedman, who Ronald Reagan elevates as the guru of economics, who says, no, that's not your job. Your job is to return money to the shareholders. That's all your job is. So what happens as a result? Well, as author Duff McDonald, in his new book, The Golden Passport, Harvard Business School, The Limits of Capitalism and the Moral Failure of the MBA Elite, states, between 1975 and 1985, 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies were convicted of serious crimes. I think that's an astounding. We sort of worship business in this country. Anchor Hocking was in a boring old company. They made glass measuring cups and glass pie dishes and glass tumblers, glass ashtrays back when everybody smoked. Millions and millions of them. They returned the same dividend every year. It was what was called a widows and orphans stock. You could count on it forever. So what happens? Well, there's a guy named Carl Icahn. Some of you may have heard that name. He's now an advisor to Donald Trump. Carl Icahn performed what was then known as green mail, where he comes into your company and you find out by looking at your SEC files that suddenly Carl Icahn's hedge fund owns about 5% of your company, and then you know what's going to happen. And sure enough, he showed up in Lancaster and he said, I'm going to make all sorts of trouble for you. I want a board seat or 2 board seats. You need to do this, you need to do that. And the people in Lancaster, the executives, Anchor Hocking, it was like a deer in the headlights. He would also say to them, by the way, if you want to buy me out at a premium, I'll go away, hence green mail. It's really like a mafia extortion scheme. And that's what happened. They paid Anchor Hocking a premium, and he went away. And then that became public, and Anchor Hocking is suddenly on the radar. It became what is known in these finance circles as in play. Anchor Hocking is now in play. Nobody paid attention to it before. Now it's in play. I think that's a very, as a writer, I think that's a very evocative thing to say. Here's a company that has helped support a town, employs a lot of people. Now it's a piece on a chessboard. Nobody cares what it actually does. It's in play. Well, a variety of things happen, and it's a long story that I took 300 pages to tell. So I won't tell you all of it now. But eventually it falls into the hands of private equity. So here's where we sort of have a little medicine that you have to take with a spoonful of sugar. People who have criticized the book in a friendly way, and it's a legit criticism, say, man, I kind of couldn't get through the business stuff, and I get it. I couldn't get through the business stuff. I looked and read and studied about 3,200 documents and SEC filings, and when you're on the 400th footnote of an SEC filing and your head's about to break open, you think, God, how do I make this into a book? Well, I did the best I could, so try to be patient. Private equity, or PE for short, really used to be known as a leveraged buyout shop. So what does that mean? It means that you go out and you buy a company with money you don't have. You use debt for the company. So how might this work? Well, so let's say that I am Brian Alexander, a private equity firm, and I go to all of you. Probably not as individuals. I probably go to institutions like, for example, the Ohio Teachers Pension Fund, which invested in one of the private equity companies that later invested in Anchor Hocking. And I need to make a return on this retirement fund, right? So I distribute that around. I buy some stocks, and I do some other things. But one of the things I do is I put with a private equity company. Well, the PE company, Brian Alexander PE, goes out, and they form a big swimming pool, and they dump all this money in a big swimming pool. And then they go shopping. They go shopping for companies. Now, they don't use all that money on any one company. It's $5 million here, $5 million there. Well, gosh, when one of the companies bought Anchor Hocking, they paid $75 million for it. They didn't use $75 million. They used much less of that. How? Well, they form a little sort of blank check company, or what's called a SPAC, Special Acquisitions Company. So that sits outside of the private equity company. They fund that with some money out of their swimming pool. They have that money go out and borrow a bunch of money from banks, insurance companies. At the case of Anchor Hocking, it was Nationwide Insurance, Voya, the little cute orange rabbit that dances around, some banks. And this new entity over here goes and buys Anchor Hocking, and now that debt belongs to this company over here. So that debt's on their books, not the private equity firm's books. That's all theirs. So then what happens? Well, the lenders, the debt providers, the companies have to pay them, right? So they loaned you, if Voya has lent you $10 million, well, you've got to pay interest on that debt. But also the PE fund starts to make money. Well, how do they do that? Well, there's a variety of ways they can do it. In fact, it's really amazing how you can make a lot of money out of failure. Here's one way. There was a company, a PE firm called Cerberus. Cerberus at one point owned Chrysler before the Great Recession. It's run by a fellow by the name of Steve Feinberg, who is another confidant and advisor to Donald Trump. By the way, thanks for having me here today. I read today that journalists are once again enemies of the people, so it's very brave of you to. So they start to not pay into the company pension fund because it makes their bottom line look a little bit better for a while. But they're not really worried about that because a PE firm really doesn't want to own a company for very long. They're like house flippers. They want to sell this off later on. So they have no interest in investing in machines, in keeping up the factory, or certainly not investing in a pension fund because they're going to be long gone by then. So they just don't pay into it. And then when the bankruptcy happens, an outfit called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation has to take over that pension. And the retirees may or may not get their whole pension out of that. And as we speak today, the Pension Guarantee Corporation is in crisis. One of the reasons that it's in crisis is because this is a regular playbook. This happens all the time. This is what I mean by saying that this is a new extractive industry. These companies are often like coal mines. They're platforms to extract cash without any of the responsibility involved in that. It's a great way to make a living in private equity. One of the reasons why it's a great way to make a living is because of what's called carried interest. You may remember from the last election, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump said that they were going to eliminate the so-called carried interest loophole. It hasn't happened, and the new tax law doesn't do anything about the carried interest loophole. So you actually get a better tax rate by doing this as opposed to your regular income. Another way that private equity can extract cash is by what's known as advisory fees. So I buy this company, and of course I get my guys who are in the private equity company and I give them the board seats. So I now effectively control the target company, and I tell the target company, you need our business wisdom. And because you need our business wisdom, we are going to get consulting fees. And they add up to millions of dollars a year. Another thing they do is what's called the sale leaseback. In the case of Anchor Hocking, there was a distribution center out on West Fair Avenue called the DC. Anchor Hocking owned that outright since the 1960s. One of the private equity companies sold the distribution center to what's called a vulture real estate fund, and then leased back that distribution center, which they owned outright, for over $1 million a year. So that's another thing that companies got to pay. My favorite, however, is what's called the Dividend Recap. Now remember, if I'm the PE guys, I control the company. And I can have the board declare a dividend. But God, there's all this debt. At one point, Anchor Hocking owed $400 million in debt. So what do? You borrow more money. You call it a dividend recap, recapitalization. And let's say it's $30 million. $10 million stays with the company, and you take $30 million off the top. This is another common maneuver by private equity companies. So this is too bad for Lancaster, it's too bad for Anchor Hocking. In a sense, Glass House is not a book about Lancaster and Anchor Hocking. It's a book about the entire United States economy. This is Sears. So Eddie Lampert just managed last week to convince a court, in a bankruptcy court, by the way, to let him buy the company he owned. He got to buy it again, but at a much lower rate. Yesterday, Payless Shoes announced that they're closing 2,100 stores. Private equity owned. And by the way, there's a shopping mall in Lancaster called River Valley Mall. Some of you may have been there. Sears store, Payless Shoes, another store called Elder Beerman used to be there. Those are all empty now. Doesn't only happen in towns like Lancaster. Toys R Us, 33,000 Americans lose their jobs. Private equity owned, lots and lots of debt. Claire's stores, Tops grocery stores in New York State, Marsh supermarkets in Indiana, Winn-Dixie grocery stores, iHeartRadio, 9 West Shoes. I could come up with 20 other names. I would like to play something for you. I have been accused of having a political axe to grind. I should tell you that I was once the president of the Fairfield County Teenage Republicans, just so you know. I hope it shows up here. This is the voice of a man who headed a very prominent Ohio company and had a very large business career outside of Ohio also. I don't play it because it's complimentary to me. I play it so that you know that it's not just me standing up here saying this stuff. It's only about 15 seconds. And it's not going to show up. Where's the... Well, okay. That'll interrupt things. Anyway, it's about a 15-second voicemail message. He said he had to stop reading the book several times because it got to be so emotional for him. Why was it so emotional? Because it was the story of my business career, he said. So many bad things that have happened with the advent of financial engineering. So it's not just me. Conservative businessmen often feel exactly the same way. Now remember, so we've had our little medicine there about how private equity works. So what does that mean for the town and for wealth and poverty? Why is this important? That's Main Street today. Still looks beautiful. Sherman's house is right there with the American flags in the front. The old Moose Lodge is there. The mayor of Lancaster hates this book. He says it was too negative. I thought it was very positive about Lancaster and the love that people have for the town. People love their town. I still love the town. So that's Main Street today. This is Anchor Hocking today from a different perspective. Why is Foundation Dinners located there? Foundation Dinners serves a lunch and a dinner every single day to about 40 or 50 people on the west side of town, out of the goodness of the hearts of the people who run Foundation Dinners. It's directly across the street from what used to be the economic heart of the town. People need that free food. They're not just freeloaders, as some people might tell you. So this happens to town. Lancaster is one of 200 towns. So what do you get? Well, poor people are a great market. It's very expensive to be poor. One of the things that happens is you may not be able to open a bank account. Ohio is one of the friendliest states in the United States toward payday lenders and car title loan lenders that charge upwards of 3,000% interest. What happens? I think this is a decent summary of what happens when you erode the social contract. I would like to read, if any of you have read the book, you'll know the names of these two characters in the book. One's named Lloyd, and one is named Mark, and I actually have an update on Lloyd. There's a little bit of foul language in here, but it's nothing you haven't heard before. So I caught up with them the last time that I spent any time in Lancaster. Lloyd was 43 at the time. He'd just been released from state prison out in Chillicothe. He was selling heroin. This is Lloyd. I'm doing good in my recovery, man. Staying away from the shit. Last week, when we was going over to this guy's house to buy a used bandsaw, I walk in and walk past this bedroom, and the door is open, and there's some dude with a needle in his arm, and it didn't even trigger me. Lonnie B., you knew Lonnie B., right? We was friends since we was little. They found his body out in one of them green fields the other morning, out in the middle of the field, and it was cold as hell, so I figured he OD'd at somebody's house and they dumped his body over there because they didn't want to have it in their place, you know? That was hard, man. This is Mark, who's 30 years old. Nathan was trying to get his shit together. He really was. I mean, he'd relapsed, but he was trying, dude. And then, New Year's Day, the fucking cops come over and bust in his door, and there he is, eating a pork dinner with his mom because it's New Year's. And those motherfuckers told him he'd have to wear a wire on Nick. And his mom's yelling at the cops to get the fuck out of her house. And it's like it's all coming down on him. He lost his job, this girl stringing him along, and then the cops threatening him. And that night, his mom goes up to the bedroom. And there's Nathan, hanging in the closet. We were good friends, dude. I lost so many friends. Me and Andrea knew Lonnie B. and his kid's mom. She's still out using. It's everywhere. You said the other day how when you were writing the book, it was as bad as it could get. And it made me think about everyone that passed away since I've been sober. And it's 3 times the people in the 2 years clean. And it's more and more. I'm now in that place where I can look at it like, how could you keep doing the shit when everyone is dying and that way you feel? But it's now easy to forget how hard it really is to not do what you know, and I don't want to forget. Choosing not to use today means I get to wake up tomorrow. Sorry, I get a little... This ought to really piss you off. Now, if you were to ask a lot of people in Lancaster, they would put the blame for addiction and death and prison terms and family dissolution squarely on the shoulders of people like Mark and Lloyd. They believe in what I call the cult of personal responsibility. Okay, you should be personally responsible. In 2007 and 2008, Drug distributors shipped almost 9 million hydrocodone pills to one pharmacy in the town of Kermit, West Virginia, population 392. In 2007 alone, McKesson, a giant Fortune 500 healthcare company, sent 3,289,900 doses of hydrocodone into Mingo County, West Virginia, whose population in 2007 was 26,679. That's about 124 pills for every man, woman, and child in the country. Where's their personal responsibility? Lloyd went to prison. Mark spent time in jail. They also suffered the effects of dope sickness. You probably all know about the Sackler family of Purdue Pharmaceuticals, one of the richest families in the United States. From 2008 to 2016, well into the opioid epidemic, the board of Purdue, on which family members sat, voted to pay over $4 billion to the Sacklers. As Shannon Manette, the woman I mentioned earlier, told me, think of community cohesion. Think of social capital, social trust and ties, investment in a community, having a stable employer in communities where residents feel like these employers care about the community. That only strengthens cohesion and trust, civic responsibility and cooperation. These are all protective against disease and deaths of despair. Is that what American business is doing today? Well, we had a new tax law, came out. According to the Wall Street Journal, buyback spending, meaning share buybacks, which elevates the price of the shares, and CEOs are now often compensated based on the price of the shares. Buyback spending is projected to hit $940 billion for 2019, exceeding the $770 billion in 2018 and the previous high of $558 billion in 2015. People love their communities. They live there. Places like Lancaster, their great-grandfathers lived there. They have a lot of social capital. It's heartbreaking. It's distressing when a lot of that begins to erode. It creates a ripple effect, not only throughout the town, but throughout the nation. So the very boring, intricate stuff at the bottom in the footnotes of SEC filings makes a major impact on our social and cultural life and on the issue of wealth and poverty. I hope you'll have some questions. Thank you. If you want to yell at me, you can do that on Twitter.
Okay, so we are recording today, so we'd like to capture your questions through the microphone. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll run this around.
Thank you for coming today. First of all, I need to clarify, I live in Baltimore, not Lancaster.
Okay. Well.
It's a suburb of Lancaster, okay. I think one of the compelling parts of the book to me was how you weaved in the narratives of so many different people. And I wonder if you know how they have reacted to what you've written. Have they read it? What has been their reaction to it all?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, I wanted to make sure that I read a text message that I got just the other day, just 2 days ago. Let's see here. It was from, there it is. This is Lloyd, who I just quoted, who was 43. Hey, it's Lloyd. I found your number again and wanted to say hi. I relapsed in March of last year, but since then, so many great things has taken place in my life. I'm coming up on my 1-year sobriety date in March. Life is awesome. I was really thrilled to get that. Lloyd actually had a 740 batting average on the prison softball team, too. Most people who are in the book actually like the book. I think it's probably 50-50 within Lancaster about the mayor hates the book and has made it known that he hates the book. And I get it. I mean, Lancaster is really trying hard to sort of come back. And they're doing some really good things. Some good things are happening in Lancaster. Supposedly, I heard just the other day there's a rumor that there's going to be some big announcement about a new company coming in. So the last thing the mayor wants is a book to come out that talks about business going downhill and heroin. He doesn't want that. Nobody has said that it's not true. It's more of, I don't want to see that stuff because we're looking over here. And I understand that. By and large, I've been really gratified because I was very nervous, obviously, when the book came out. What are they going to say? I'm still in touch with a lot of people who were there, but it's mainly been positive. But certainly there have been those people who say, you came in here and you trashed our town. In fact, another friend of mine who grew up in Lancaster about the same time I did, read the book, called me up and said, man, you love that town a lot more than I do. So it depends on how you read it.
Thank you. I'd like to say first I loved the book. It was a great explanation as to what's happened to not only Lancaster, but so many other places in our country. And I remember driving through Lancaster hundreds of times and watching what was happening to Hocking Glass. So thank you for explaining that.
Well, thank you.
It seems that we tend to be hogwashed with the theory that all the jobs are going overseas and neoliberalism is to blame and such. And I think your book explained, and you explained today, that with your financial engineering kind of concepts, that it's every man for himself kind of theory, and the big hog takes all.
Right.
And I just wondered, do you see any way around that? Right now, I'm a little concerned because I see a lot of OU students on a regular basis, and I see a lot of finance majors, and I just kind of wonder what they're being taught, whether they're being taught how to exploit things that make the quick buck and destroy companies.
Well,
I don't see so many liberal arts majors anymore, so I do notice that. So.
I can recommend Duff McDonald's book, Golden Passport, about Harvard MBAs and the Harvard MBA program. It's a very interesting look at what are those people being taught, what are the ethics and the morals and the worldview of those people. Here's another example in the news right now. McKinsey and Company. Are any of you familiar with McKinsey and Company? If it's not the largest, it's one of the largest consulting firms in the world. So not only are they trying to polish up the Prince of Saudi Arabia's image lately, but they worked with Purdue Pharma to how to get more prescriptions written for OxyContin. Even though the market was already saturated, how do you do that? And then they consulted on how Purdue Pharma could go into the addiction treatment business. And now it's come out the other day in the New York Times, McKinsey actually had a nearly secret fund based offshore. I want to say the Caymans, but don't quote me on that. That they would actually invest in some of the countries they were doing consulting for, so an obvious conflict of interest. I mean, this stuff has become pervasive. And I don't mean to slam business. Business can be good. I'm a capitalist. Business can be a force for good. And it was a long time for a force for good. You know, it's not like before Anchor Hocking was a giant charity. It wasn't. I.J. Collins, who founded Anchor Hocking, was a hard ass. He wanted to pay his guys as little as they could be paid. No question about it. But what happened? Well, we had the New Deal. We had the Wagner Act, the labor law. Unions formed. And so there became this counterbalance, this kind of equilibrium that really held sway from, let's say, just before the outbreak of World War II until the late 1970s, early 1980s. That's responsible for how I got to go to college. That's broken now, and yet we still think that that's the way it's supposed to be. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I just want to give you thanks again also for this great presentation. I'm curious, I've been reading recently, and my understanding of some of the research is that in more individualistic societies compared to collectivistic societies, there is, particularly when there's a great gap, an inequitable gap in people's income, that it does reinforce us and them kind of mentalities and this degradation of the social contract, as you mentioned. What are some of your ideas, or what would you like to see, particularly within the university setting? How could we in this room apply this great information to ensure that the university, whether it's student, staff, and faculty, or our community partners, can return to the concepts of all working toward the greater good?
I have a couple of suggestions. I mentioned some of them to people at lunch today. I said, yeah, I often do things like if I were king, right? So if I were king, high schools would get slightly off the whole STEM mania that's going on right now and spend a lot more time teaching civics and history. I mean, you can go around Lancaster, you go around a lot of communities. I mean, I'm working on another book now up in the far northwest corner of Ohio. You can go around a lot of communities, and you can talk to people under 40, and they wouldn't be able to tell you who their U.S. representative is. So they don't vote. This idea that all the guys that work in the glass plant were the Trump voters, they didn't vote. They didn't vote at all, period, right? So, sorry, I think I get a little. So I would downgrade STEM, do more civics and history. I would also teach some more humanities. I mean, I was an English lit major, right? So I want to teach the humanities. But the humanities teach you a little bit about how to be a human. So take some of that with your business degree and realize that there's a human equation at the end of whatever it is you're doing in business. And then there are very practical things. Why is the carried interest rate still there? It's there because of who's lobbying to keep it there. Eliminate carried interest. That's just one way to go about it. Make it so that you can't foist so much leverage, other words, debt, onto these companies. Make it so the SEC gets a lot more enforcement personnel and starts actually enforcing some of the laws.
Thank you for your talk. The first realization I had that Donald Trump might win the election was when I drove up to Lancaster, and I went from a town of Athens in which I saw 2 Trump signs to a town in which Trump signs were everywhere, and you saw very few Clinton signs. So I guess my question is, how would you explain that? And a related one is, I've heard your book described as kind of a counter-argument to Vance's book on hillbillyology.
Did I tell you?
So maybe there's a connection, maybe there's not, but thank you. And thanks for propping history.
Yeah. I don't know, JD said he might actually be here today. Is he here? No, okay. Okay, so I laugh because I was telling somebody earlier that literally every time I speak anywhere, I get the hillbillyology question. The only difference is he sold like 90 gajillion books, so I have some catching up to do. First part of the question. When I first moved back to Lancaster to do this book, I was surprised. I was telling somebody earlier that when I was a kid growing up in Lancaster, if somebody was walking around town with a gun on their hip, they would have been arrested. I mean, that would be like the weirdest thing that you could do, which was not to say that people didn't have guns. I mean, half the dads I knew had at least a deer rifle. So it's not like it was an anti-gun thing. It was, why are you walking around town with a pistol on your hip? Now people walk around, I write in the book about a guy who mows his lawn with a 9mm strapped to his hip. I wonder what he thinks is going to happen. Is going to be a lawnmower hijacking? I don't understand that. I think there's a general kind of constant low-level fear, and it's an indefinable fear that everything's gone to hell and something bad could happen any minute. When I was a kid, it was the opposite. It was like something probably good is going to happen today. There was a little bit more optimism. When I spoke to the union guys, the Flint glass workers, which is a union I dearly love, I said, what are the guys in the plant thinking about the presidential election? And this guy said, we hate everybody. And I think they kind of did hate everybody. Let's be very honest about this. The Democrats didn't do any favors for the Flint glass workers or many other union guys for that matter. The Democrats completely dropped the ball for about a generation. One of the largest sort of on a personal level, contributors, not one of the largest, but a guy who maxed out his contributions to Hillary Clinton was one of the partners in the last PE fund that owned Anchor Hocking. The Clintons were good buddies with all these guys. So let's not pretend otherwise. I think my first inkling happened at the bar of the Lancaster Country Club when I heard a table of women saying, I like this Trump because he tells it like it is. The fact that Trump was willing to offend people really appealed to me. It didn't matter if it was true or not. He's willing to just offend people. One of my theories, and it may, I'm not an expert in anything. I know how to write a book, but otherwise I'm not an expert. But a theory that I've had is that people, like you find many in Lancaster and many other places, they're tired of being yelled at all the time. You shouldn't eat this. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't believe like this. You shouldn't kill deer. You shouldn't, why are you doing, Athens, man. The reputation of Athens, gotta say, little touchy-feely. And they're tired of it. And they wanted to give the finger to all of you and me and people in New York and just because what they get for the last 35 years, right? They didn't get anything. They've seen mainly bad stuff for 35 years. Silicon Valley guys are rich. New York guys are rich. California guys are rich. What's in it for them? Trump's willing to call BS on a lot of that stuff. I don't think he's right, but I sympathize with the point of view. Did I get both your? Oh, Hillbilly, yeah, okay. So my response to Hillbilly Elegy is that I actually liked the book. I thought it was a very affecting family, personal memoir. I think it's fair to say that J.D. Vance and I disagree pretty strongly about sort of social policy and politics. J.D.'s a conservative, but I actually think he's a sincere conservative. J.D.'s not a lunatic. He's a smart guy. He's sincere in his beliefs. He's not always wrong. I get a little annoyed. There's a line in his book that I talk about where he says that no government program can solve these problems, but he's just told us how he basically went through the world's largest government program, which is the United States Marines. So he goes to Ohio State on the GI Bill, and that's his ticket out. So, it's this idea of personal responsibility. It's not that I deny that you shouldn't have personal responsibility. Of course you should. And if, kids do better in stable two-parent families. They do. Conservatives aren't wrong about that. But what if you don't have the bootstraps to pull yourself up by? There's kind of a superstructure around all of us. And how do we access the rungs on the ladder of this superstructure? If you can't access them, or literally don't know how to access them, then you're kind of screwed. There's now the wife of the former mayor of Lancaster, one of the smartest women I met in Lancaster, realized that people did not know how to use a bus to get to job and family services. They have literally zero life skills. Remember, this is not the first generation this has happened to. We're now over a generation and a half into this erosion that I talk about. They didn't know how to, so she said, I'm going to start an organization, and she did. One of the great things about Lancaster and many small towns is that people see a problem and they get together and say, hey, let's do something about it. So basically it's a life skills class. Here's how you get the bus. Here's how you go to do that. Here's how you fill out the form. Here's how you get to the grocery store. Here's diet that you maybe should be eating. Very, very basic stuff. That is my sort of objection to the political, social part of hillbillyology. Oh, sorry.
I guess my question is how you said a big problem is the financial engineering happening, and then another problem that recently Neil deGrasse Tyson highlighted in one of his books, we're losing ground to Asian companies, Asian countries in innovation and technology and really growing our youth's education there. And then also the big 5 companies like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Walmart are really starting to enter every industry and almost becoming omniscient to where investors won't even invest in a small business because they know Amazon is getting into that and
Right.
stuff like that. Do you see us continually digging our own grave, or do you see that there's like relief in the future coming from the government?
Well, you're actually addressing my next book. We are undergoing unprecedented economic concentration and consolidation. The companies you named are perfect examples of that. Yes, it's a big, big risk. Now, these Asian companies you're talking about, they're often hugely concentrated. I mean, Samsung, for example, a hugely consolidated, it's a monopoly.
Do you think like the government is going to step in?
Not now. That's one of the things that I'm reporting on now is what can happen and how maybe it can happen. See, we've actually done this before. 1920s, 1930s, there was enormous economic concentration, also partly into the 1940s. And the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities Exchange Commission, the US Justice Department actually went after this because they wanted to foster smaller businesses. They wanted lots of competition. Healthcare is a perfect example. You see it here in Ohio all the time. We talk about hospital systems, for example. We talk about underserved counties that maybe had a small hospital in the county, and then Ohio Health comes in, and what happens? Well, often prices rise because of that, because they have this economic pricing power. So it's a very important issue that you've hit on. So yeah, I think it's a real danger, and I think that, look, there's a place for government. I don't believe that government solves all questions, but the government is there to be on your side when you're a little bit less powerful than the other guy is. Yeah, this side is all like,
Thanks for everything you've said. And you've kind of touched on this, but I wanted to see if you want to elaborate on it anymore. Are you familiar with what Shannon Monette has written about voting patterns and
yeah, it's the middle
income
class.
inequality? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the middle class. And so why is that? Again, don't know, just an opinion, a guess. I think the middle class is terrified. So if we have, a lot of you must be students, I hope, and so I just learned today that you're paying like $25,000 a year to go to Ohio University. That blew my mind a little bit, right? My personal opinion is that Ohio University ought to be close to free. And the legislature ought to appropriate enough money to be able to make that happen. Because that's the future of the company. Why was Ohio such an economic powerhouse for so many years? One of the reasons is because the government created the land-grant college system. The government did that. People talk about how dynamic Columbus is right now. It is. Well, how much of that dynamism is because Ohio State's there? That's the government. How did we get the Transcontinental Railroad? The government. How did we get the airplane industry? The government subsidized airmail and fostered an aircraft. Drugs. How many drugs come from government-sponsored research and development, and then intellectual property goes to Pfizer or whoever? The government does that. So there's a place for government. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very important that not only education, but this stuff be more available. You shouldn't have to, you shouldn't have to spend the first 20 years of your working life paying off your student loan.
As I said before, question should be from this side. So, anyone on this side? No? Why don't I ask question then? We'll go later to you. In your book, you include a lot of interviews with those workers and residents in Lancaster. So I was wondering what would be the benefits and limitations of talking to people. I mean, you're writing, so it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, there's a danger when you do what I do that you think you know more than everybody. And there's also a danger that you want to argue with people when they say something that. And so I think listening is the most important. Listen to people about where they are, where they're coming from, what they have to say, and then you learn things from them. I think talking directly to people rather than doing research in a library or the internet is earlier there was a phase in my reporting career where nobody had any money. I don't know if any of you are students at Scripps. Any Scripps? Okay, right? I think you are either the bravest people or the most naive people that there are. You used to be able to make a good living in journalism. And then there came an era where people would call me up and say, why don't you do this story on this and this, but don't go anywhere. Do it by phone. There's no replacing sitting across from a guy over a Bud Light in a bar, getting to know him or her. And that takes time, and that takes money. So speaking to people slowly, not rattling off a lot of questions, let them talk. It's amazing, really, when you ask people, invite people to share their personal stories with you, people are actually eager to do that. They want to. They've lived a life. Like some of these glass guys, they've been working in the furnace room for 40 years. And if you've read the book, that's not the easiest job in the world to do. And so what comes through is the pride that they have in their job. They'll complain about it, no end, but they actually love it. Because they can do that. Not many people can do that. So they walk out of that plant every day and think, man, I worked hard. They have a lot of pride in that. And you can't get that over a phone. You can't get it in one conversation. You got to meet with people over and over again and really listen to what they say. I don't know what percent has been affected by offshoring. I know Anchor Hocking's big issue was not offshoring, partly because of the nature of glass making and the fact that making something in China, making baking dishes in China and shipping it here because they're so heavy and they tend to break, is really not all that practical. There's a reason why Libby, for example, in Toledo is still making a lot of glass in Toledo. It's because of that very thing, which is not to say they don't have some plants out of the country. They do have a plant, for example, in Mexico. I'm sympathetic to your California housing issue. I own a house in San Diego. It's where I live when I'm not living in Ohio. Yeah, it's difficult. I'm not sure I understand your point about no slack in the labor market. There is very low unemployment in Ohio at the moment. The county that I'm currently working in has very low unemployment. And they have not. And so, well, they've only just recently begun to budge up a little bit.
This isn't so much an issue of unemployment.
Right.
It is, I can tell you, you
Well, that's why I actually used to be somewhat anti-union. I hear you. I hear you. Gotcha. I gotcha. I used to be somewhat anti-union because I was in a union, and a guy came up to one time and threatened me. I was a college kid and didn't know any better, and he said, "You're going to walk out with us, aren't you?" I said, "Well, no, it's my summer job." And I'm like, and he said, "Well, we know what car you drive." So I thought, "Oh, that's not cool." But after doing a lot more reporting and time in Lancaster and reporting on another book idea that I've got, I actually think unions, strong unions, are vitally important. Why? Well, we had an era in this country where we had a strong labor movement. We also had incredible productivity increases, incredible profits, higher wages. It was very much a sweet spot. Now, people have made the argument to me, well, that was after World War II, and Europe was decimated, and so captive market, and they didn't have the capacity. You look at it, and that doesn't really hold up as much as you might think. I am not a labor historian. As I say, I'm not an expert in anything. I'm a journalist. So you may be correct, but I would push back a little bit about the idea that you cannot have strong unions, low unemployment, and rising wages. I don't see why you can't. And that's actually part of the problem here in Ohio, is wages have been just recently they've begun to edge up slightly, but you cannot have unemployment like you've got and not finally give people a little bit more money. A business owner in a small town in Ohio said to me about 2 months ago, I said, God, I'm walking around here and all these employers are saying they can't get anybody to work for them. The young people have no work ethic. And he looked at me and he goes, that's bullshit. All you have to do is pay them some money. So that's from a business owner, not a Democrat, by the way, Republican guy. You just got to pay people more money. Look, I can't address your immigration. I'm not an expert on immigration and what the effect on labor market is of immigration. You may be entirely correct. I just don't know. I don't know. I can tell you, just so you know, I'm not a build-the-wall guy. Okay, it probably doesn't surprise you, but you may be correct. I don't know.
I think we're going to have to. I hate to interject here, but this might be a good time to, in respect of people's time, draw things to a close. Thanks for the great dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank our speaker.